Very appropriate just before communion. Little message I simply call the point of no return. I had to go through this first before I was vaguely able to share this appropriately. And it happened at a time when I nearly lost my wife after the birth of our son in 1969 in Zimbabwe. She was in hospital for a month with a deep vein clot that they couldn't dissolve. And when the doctor called me at work and he said, you better come and take your wife to hospital, then go home and collect her belongings. It's that serious. Wow. She spent a month in hospital and it was touch and go. And I had to make a decision during this time. I've learned that men aren't equipped to handle a 3-year-old daughter and a 10-day-old baby son. And we had no family around. They were all 1,000-odd kilometers away. And not too many friends. And I was broken. And the Lord, I wouldn't say he appeared to me, but it was that vivid. And said, if I'm going to take her at this time, are you prepared to carry on with me? Gee, hard question. I heaved a big sigh and I said, Lord, you know that. I'll go on with you, whatever. I crossed a point of no return. And things began to happen in my life and ministry almost as a sign of trust. Although I wasn't looking for that. She did survive. It dramatically reversed, and she's alive and well today. And she's been my best friend for 55 years. So, with that pitiful little platform, let me just share this with you. Scripture comes from John 12, 20 and 26. Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. They then came to Philip, who was from this side of Galilee, because he was from Greek background, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And Philip came and told Andrew, and Philip told Jesus. Now, obviously the Greeks were looking for something spectacular. Jesus answered them, saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. In other words, you're going to see something spectacular far beyond what you thought. Most assuredly, I say to you, and here's the key verse, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. And he followed up with an explanation. He who loves his life will lose it. And he who puts his life last in this world will keep it for life eternal. If anyone serves me, let him follow me. Where I am, there my servant will also be. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. Now clearly Jesus spoke about himself as being that grain of wheat. Unless I fall into the ground and die, I remain alone. But if the seed dies, it produces much grain. Now those of you familiar with farming and planting and anything botanical know that a seed has a tremendous potential in it, but it remains one seed by itself if it preserves itself selfishly. Its purpose is to be sown into the ground where it goes through an immense process. Yeah, I'm talking to people of the land. You know what I'm talking about. Immense process of softening, breaking open for its potential to come out. And eventually, if you dug it up, that would be dangerous. You'd find a totally new identity there. The old's gone, the new's come. And a new life with little roots has gone down and a little shoot pushing up in order to bear more fruit. And that is an amazing illustration from nature. It applied to Jesus. You know, when you think about it, he had no sin in him. And if refusing to do his Father's will wouldn't be counted as a sin, perish that thought, poor theology, he could still be living today in an unscarred body. But it wasn't his purpose. He was the seed falling into the ground to die. And look at the immense fruit worldwide over millennia as a result of him being sown as a seed. But this applies to us. Because Jesus said, as my Father has sent me, even so send I you. There's no escaping it. It is the key to spiritual growth. Whether we're going to have a great public ministry, and that's in God's hands, or a very fruitful personal ministry, like an Ananias from Damascus. We are to be that grain of wheat as well. Now, we can stay as one seed, or we can die to self and live for Him. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm sure all of you know about it, but it impacted me immensely in 1972 when God called me from business to ministry. It was an unusual calling because I had a lay ministry that I would never expect to be offered to any businessman. I was 24, 25, 26, etc. in Harare, and I was being called out from work because I was virtually boss of the department. I could go and do it, go and minister in schools. I had the awesome joy of helping to plant the first YWAM base in Zimbabwe. And churches were calling me out in the country areas. I learned a lot of the Mashona language during that time because I'm a Zulu speaker, and they laughed at my accent. But the Lord changed things. And there was a big call that came into my life. Now, just prior to that, I heard the story. It was told by a Youth for Christ director from the United States by the name of Wendy Collins. It was a man, I think it was short for Wendell or something like that. Wendy Collins, he was known as. And he told a story about a friend of his by the name of Ed McCulley. They'd done many projects together with Youth for Christ. Ed McCulley, a dedicated Christian, very talented young man. He held athletic track records, played the trombone beautifully, great public speaker. In fact, he'd won the United States oratorical contest out of some 10,000 students. Not a mean feat. And he was at law school studying to be a lawyer with a great future ahead of him. Actually, it was a young man studying with him at that time who influenced him. And that other young man's name was Jim Elliott. You'll know the name. He made an amazing decision. He said to Wendy Collins, I'm leaving all this. I'm quitting law school. I'm going to missionary training college. I'm heading for the jungles of Ecuador in South America. And Wendy Collins said to him, Ed, you're crazy. You're absolutely crazy with all the potential and opportunity you've got. Those cannibals you're going to try and reach won't appreciate your speaking ability. They certainly won't appreciate your trombone playing. They'll think it's some sort of blowtorch. But you're wasting your time and your life. Well, Ed answered him that day with a famous statement. He said, I can do nothing else but God's will. These are the exact words. God's will has become my command. Because in my own personal life, I've crossed the point of no return. I must go and do what God has told me to do. Well, he did what God told him to do. He quit law school, went to missionary training college, completed his studies. He and a group of 4 other young guys, their wives and children, went to Ecuador in 1952. They were called the Ecuador Five. Roger Udarian, Pete Fleming, Jim Elliott. I think I was allowed by God to get into these guys' heads some way. It tore me up. Nate Saint, Ed McCulley. Well, the ministry to the Orcas in the fall of 1955, Ed McCulley, along with Jim Elliott, missionary pilot Nate Saint, began Operation Orca. They planned to reach the previously uncontacted Orca Wadani tribe. And since the Wadani had a reputation of one of the most murderous tribes on earth, everything was done to win their trust first. The missionaries began by making gift drops by Nate Saint's plane. They would do narrow circles, and they'd lower a bucket on a rope, where the bucket stayed focused on the ground while they flew around in circles, and would only help themselves. Well, the area was in the Carari River near Ecuador, and you see a beachhead there that Nate Saint said he could land his plane and also take off. So they landed their plane on that riverbank. January 1956, when the ministries felt they'd built up enough of a rapport with the Wadani, they decided to land. Nate Saint landed on that sandbar. However, After friendly ground contact with 3 orcas, the missionaries were attacked by a party of 6 orcas and 3 women. And McCully was the 4th of the 5 missionaries to be speared by a young orca named Minkei. Well, that news flooded around the world with the not-so-good communications as we have today. They died in an attempt to share the gospel. Wow. Wendy Collins heard the news, and he wrote he felt a deep personal sorrow that his friend Ed McCully and the others were gone. But he couldn't get out of his head the words of Ed McCully. Doesn't matter. I've crossed the point of no return. And Jim Elliot, who died with them that day, had this famous statement he written in his diary. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. When you think of that, we can't keep our lives. God could call it up at any time. You give that, dying to self and living for Christ and in obedience to him, you'll gain what you can't lose. And they gained. Shortly after that, Wendy Collins wrote that a new jet interceptor had just been introduced to the US Air Force, 1956. It was that plane there. A young Christian pilot couldn't take him up, but he sat in the cockpit and he asked questions. And on the right-hand side, you'll see at the bottom right-hand side, the square gauge, a fuel gauge. But this plane had a red plastic marker with a little set screw where you could move the marker backwards and forwards and set it on theoretically the halfway mark. And when pilots flew out on a mission or a training run, they knew the weight of the plane with bombs and missiles. They knew the winds to and from, and they worked out where the halfway mark would be on the fuel. And in flying out, they had to preserve the plane themselves. Each pilot made a decision. And of course, in training, you turned back before you ran out of fuel. So that was the point of no return. However, in their training, it was told that World War II pilots in the USA and Britain, the best pilots chose to fly on when they crossed that point of no return, knowing they would not have enough fuel to get back, and knowing in their minds what torture and interrogation awaited them if they survived. However, they took risks that were more daring in their attacks on the enemy targets than if they'd had their own self-preservation to consider. They knew they wouldn't make it back, so they were dead to themselves already, but still very much hilariously alive to the mission to which they were committed. Man, that split my mind apart when I read that statement in Wendy Collins' report. And suddenly, Wendy Collins knew what Ed McCully had meant that day when he said, I've crossed the point of no return. Doesn't matter what happens to me. I'm dead to myself, and I'm alive to the mission that lay ahead. Now, I personally believe that's what the Apostle Paul meant when he said, I am crucified with Christ. Galatians 2. I'm dead with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I'm still alive, but I live by the faith or the faithfulness of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So just aside into a minor matter compared with giving our lives like this. Why are we so worried at times of what others think of it when we share Christ with them? When we tell them we receive Jesus and we're followers of him? I mean, why are we fearful? Basically because we worry about what people may think of us or say about us. Listen, folks, this is not about us. You know that. It's about God wanting people to hear the gospel and be saved. It's about Jesus' great sacrifice. It's about that person's need that God wants to meet. And I find at times a little bit of a reluctance when I'm tired. I've got to push myself deliberately through that barrier. And, I have great opportunities on airplanes to share Christ with people. And I'm going to share something with you now, a little bit humorous, but I love herbal teas. Hibiscus strawberry. This is what pushes me through this barrier. And I'm doing something very practical. Strawberry sensation. 2 of my favorites. I don't like airline coffee or tea. And I say, please bring me a mug of hot water. And an obnoxious man sitting next to me who's been very critical of the staff says, boring. I just look at him. Anyway, the cup comes full of hot water and I dip the tea bag in. And within seconds, he's saying, that smells delicious. Have you got a spare one? I said, yes. Can I have it? It's going to cost you. Now I'm getting aggressive. It's going to cost you. How much, $1? I said, no, 5 minutes of your time. And most of them say, what are you going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk to you for 5 minutes about an amazingly loving, an exceptionally forgiving, and an eternally youthful God. Wow. Never heard of God like that. Okay, mate, you got 5 minutes. So I set the timer on my watch. I start to share my testimony with the guy. And when the beep goes, I said, here we are. Enjoy your tea. Most times, they will say, come on, you got me interested, keep going. Now, you know, non-believers don't have a great attention span. I mean, a lot of believers don't have attention span either. But eventually, I get to the point of asking this guy to make a commitment. And the first time this happened, I was flying from Brisbane to Melbourne, 2.5-hour flight in Australia. And after I shared with the guy, I said, I'm going to have a sleep. I'm going to have a sleep. Turned over and I went to sleep. And I woke up about 40 minutes later with this guy leaning over me with a funny look in his eyes. And I was getting ready to give him a 5-fold ministries. But he said to me, I said, is there a problem? He said, I've never seen this before. It's like you were wrapped in a cocoon of peace. That's what he perceived. He said, is that part of the deal? I said, yes. He said, I want it. And I led him to Christ. However, as we sort of broke off conversation again, I turned around. There were 2 guys across the aisle, quickly turned away. I said, were you guys listening to me? Yes, we were. That was fascinating. I said, have a tea bag as well. Look, I need those points of contact to push myself through this barrier. Because I get a little nervous too. But I've got to convince myself, if I'm dead to self and alive to Christ, then it doesn't matter what people think about me. We're dead to Christ, dead to self and alive to the mission of leading people to Christ. Now, incidentally, have you gone beyond the story? I began to read a couple of books about this, Elizabeth Elliot's books. And I found out the end of the story, where after these 5 young missionaries had died, the world was saying, why all this great waste? The tragic news launched thousands into mission work in 1956. Like, if that's the worst that's going to happen, why are we intimidated and hanging back? People launched themselves, or God launched them into missions. In 1972, it launched me into the work I was going to do. Well, the Wadani said, and it's recorded, they saw hundreds of big men in shining white garments standing in the trees at the riverbank. And the dying men saw them too. They had that look on their faces as they died. Angels were there and saw it all happening. And they welcomed those missionaries through gates of splendor. Elizabeth Elliot's first book. And the rest of the story goes like this. In 1959, Nate Saint's sister Rachel and Jim Elliot's widow Elizabeth made contact with the tribe through one of the young Wadani women they'd led to Christ. They tended the sick to win their trust. These are the people that murdered their husbands and taught them the love of Christ. Rachel Saint, Nate Saint's wife, remained with them for 30 years. Steve Saint, the son of the murdered son, spent summers there from the age of 9. He went to live with them, and they cared for the murderers of their men. In fact, Steve Saint was adopted by Minkay, the man who'd killed his father. And Rachel Saint at one time stuck her finger out at Minkay and said, you, Minkay, killed his father. Who do you think should teach him how to live? So Minkay took over that responsibility. And while his aunt taught Christianity. There's Steve Saint in later years with the Wadani, the men who'd killed those missionaries. Now, after Rachel Saint's death in 1994, Minkay asked Steve Saint to help the tribe become less dependent on foreigners. And Steve Saint created an Indigenous Peoples Technology and Educational Center to teach dentistry and other skills for these cultures. It was his way to repay the tribe for the tutelage that he'd received at the age of 9. In fact, Minkay often teased him because the boy didn't even have any basic skills. He didn't know how to make a blowgun or a spear. Who cares? The whole tribe came to Christ and stopped their warfare. And they began preaching the gospel to other tribes. And it was a huge opening because these were notorious Wadani that the other tribes feared. At a Billy Graham conference for evangelists in Amsterdam in 2000, I was there with my wife. And we saw Steve Saint interpreting for his father's murderer on the platform to help him to share his testimony after killing those 5 missionaries. And there's the picture, taken from that platform. Of course, you might have read the books, but they're great for rereading. Through Gates of Splendor and the End of the Spear. I can't think of anything better to move into communion with than with the thought of dying to self and living for Christ. Because we know that our times are in his hands. He calls the shots, and we're his servant. And we want to bear fruit for his glory that he'll find very tasty. And because he's a generous Heavenly Father, fruit he will distribute from our lives to thousands of others. It takes dying to self and rising in new life. Probably one of the toughest messages I ever preach. But thanks for receiving it.